April 18, 1943, Rabaul, New Britain. The humid morning air carries the sound of aircraft engines warming up across the Japanese naval base. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, adjusts his white dress uniform as he prepares for what should be a routine inspection flight to Bougainville. His staff officers bow respectfully, unaware that American cryptographers in Pearl Harbor have already decoded the flight details from intercepted radio transmissions. The Imperial Japanese Navy commands the finest fighter pilots in the Pacific, flying the legendary Zero fighters that once swept all before them. Japanese commanders expect their air superiority and vast ocean distances to shield their most valuable leader from enemy interference. But in radio stations across the Allied Pacific, P-38 Lightning squadrons are already receiving coordinates and timing for an unprecedented intercept mission. This morning would prove that, in modern warfare, intelligence and technology could reach anywhere, even to strike down the untouchable. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood before the operations map in his headquarters at Rabaul, studying the defensive positions scattered across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean. At 59 years old, he carried the weight of Japan's entire naval strategy on his shoulders. His gray hair was meticulously combed, his uniform pressed to perfection despite the tropical humidity that pervaded every corner of the base. The morning briefing had concluded with reports that troubled him deeply. American industrial production continued to accelerate at an alarming pace. Intelligence estimates suggested the United States was now producing one aircraft carrier every month, while Japan struggled to replace losses from previous battles. The numbers were stark. In 1943, American shipyards would launch over 1,500 vessels of all types, while Japanese shipyards managed fewer than 300. Yamamoto's aide approached with the daily communications summary. Among the routine reports lay the seeds of catastrophe, detailed flight plans transmitted via the JN-25 Naval Code. Neither the aide nor the admiral knew that American cryptographers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had been reading these transmissions for months. The code that protected Japan's most sensitive communications had become a window for enemy intelligence. Outside the headquarters building, ground crews prepared the G-4M Betty bomber that would carry Yamamoto on his inspection tour. The twin-engine aircraft, designated G-4M-1 Model 11, had been Japan's premier medium bomber since 1941. Its 20mm cannons and 7.7mm machine guns provided defensive armament, while its range of 2,600 miles made it ideal for long-distance missions across the Pacific theater. Yet, for all its capabilities, the Betty carried a fatal flaw that Japanese engineers had never resolved. To achieve its impressive range, designers had sacrificed armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks. American pilots had nicknamed it the Flying Lighter for its tendency to explode when hit. This morning, that vulnerability would prove decisive. The weather forecast called for clear skies and excellent visibility, perfect flying conditions that would also favor intercepting fighters. As Yamamoto reviewed his schedule one final time, he remained unaware that his detailed itinerary was already being studied by American mission planners 500 miles away. The morning sun glinted off the wings of 18 Zero fighters dispersed around Rabaul's airfield. These A6M5 Model 52 aircraft represented the pinnacle of Japanese fighter design. Yet by April 1943, their legend was fading. Squadron leader Kenji Yanagiya walked among his aircraft, noting the wear that constant combat operations had inflicted on machines and men alike. The Zero had dominated Pacific skies since 1940, its 331 mm top speed and extraordinary maneuverability making it seemingly invincible. Japanese pilots had used these advantages to devastating effect at Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, and in the early Philippine campaigns. The aircraft's 20mm cannons and twin 7.7mm machine guns had proven lethal against early American fighters like the Buffalo and Wildcat. But the war had evolved beyond the Zero's capabilities. American factories were producing new fighters specifically designed to counter Japanese advantages. The P-38 Lightning, P-47 Thunderbolt, and F-6F Hellcat all possess superior speed, armor protection, and high-altitude performance. Most critically, they carried heavier armament and could sustain damage that would destroy a zero production figures, told the story of Japan's mounting crisis. Mitsubishi's Nagoya plant could produce approximately 200 Zero fighters per month at maximum capacity. Meanwhile, American factories were delivering over 2,000 fighters monthly by early 1943. The mathematics of attrition heavily favored the United States. Yanagiya's pilots averaged over 300 combat hours, each impressive experience that made them formidable opponents in individual combat. However, pilot training programs back in Japan had been shortened from 2 years to 6 months to meet replacement demands. New pilots arriving at frontline units often had fewer than 100 flight hours, inadequate preparation for modern aerial warfare. The escort mission assigned for Admiral Yamamoto's flight called for 6 Zero fighters, a standard protective formation. These aircraft would fly at 4,500 feet, providing cover for the bomber formation at 6,500 feet. The plan assumed that any enemy intercept would come from short-range carrier aircraft, not long-range fighters operating from distant land bases. At 0600 hours, ground crews began final preparations for the morning mission, unaware that their every movement was being observed by Allied coast watchers hidden in the jungle hills surrounding Rabaul. In a windowless basement beneath Pearl Harbor's administration building, Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort hunched over a desk covered with intercepted radio transmissions. The officer commanding Station Shaipo had been working 18-hour days since early 1942, leading the team that had cracked Japan's primary naval communication code. Their breakthrough had already enabled American victories at Coral Sea and Midway, but this morning brought their most valuable intelligence yet. The intercepted message, transmitted from Rabaul at 2300 hours on April 17th, contained complete details of Admiral Yamamoto's inspection tour. The JN-25 code, which Japanese commanders believed was unbreakable, had been yielding its secrets to Allied cryptographers for over a year. Each transmission provided additional confirmation of code groups and encryption patterns. Rochefort's team included linguists, mathematicians, and communication specialists drawn from universities across America. They worked with IBM tabulating machines, primitive mechanical computers that could process thousands of code combinations in hours rather than months. These machines, originally designed for census data, had been adapted for cryptographic work with remarkable success. The intelligence windfall was extraordinary. Not only did the Americans know Yamamoto's exact route and timing, but they also had details of his escort aircraft, altitude, and arrival schedules at each destination. The Japanese admiral would fly from Rabaul to Balao, then continue to Bougainville for inspections of forward airfields and defensive positions. Captain Edwin Layton, Pacific Fleet Intelligence Officer, immediately recognized the strategic implications. Yamamoto was not merely Japan's most skilled naval commander, he was the irreplaceable architect of their Pacific strategy. His death would create a leadership vacuum that Japan could not easily fill. The decision to authorize the intercept mission went directly to Admiral Chester Nimitz, who understood both the opportunity and the risks. Killing Yamamoto might alert the Japanese that their codes had been compromised, potentially ending one of America's most valuable intelligence advantages. However, the chance to eliminate Japan's premier naval strategist was too significant to ignore. By 0400 hours on April 18th, authorization had been granted for Operation Vengeance. 18 P-38 Lightning fighters from the 339th Fighter Squadron were already being prepared for the 435-mile intercept mission, the longest fighter mission attempted in the Pacific War. Major John Mitchell stood before 18 P-38 Lightning fighters at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, briefing his pilots for the most audacious mission of the Pacific War. The sleek, twin-boomed aircraft represented American industrial and technological superiority at its finest. Each Lightning cost $97,147 to produce, nearly double the price of a single-engine fighter, but their capabilities justified the expense. The P-38L models assigned to the 339th Fighter Squadron could reach 414 mph at 25,000 feet, significantly faster than any Japanese fighter. Their twin Allison V-1710 engines provided redundancy that could bring a damaged aircraft home on a single engine. Most importantly for today's mission, their range of 1,150 miles with drop tanks would allow them to fly 435 miles to the intercept point and return. Safely, armament gave the Lightning decisive advantages in air. Combat: 450 caliber Browning machine guns and 120mm Hispano cannon were concentrated in the nose, eliminating the convergence problems that plagued wing-mounted guns. This arrangement allowed pilots to engage targets at longer ranges with devastating effect. The mission profile required precise navigation and timing. 16 P-38s would fly at wave-top level to avoid Japanese radar detection, while 4 aircraft would climb to engage Yamamoto's escort fighters. The intercept point lay 315 miles northwest of Henderson Field, requiring exactly 1 hour and 35 minutes of flight time. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber were assigned to attack the bomber formation directly. Both pilots had extensive combat experience and had demonstrated exceptional marksmanship in previous engagements. Their aircraft carried full ammunition loads and extra fuel in wing tanks for the extended mission. Weather conditions favored the Americans. Clear skies would provide perfect visibility for the attack, while prevailing winds would assist their return flight to Guadalcanal. Japanese radar coverage in the Solomon Islands remained limited, with most stations focused on detecting approaching bomber formations rather than low-flying fighters. At 700 hours, ground crews completed final inspections of the Lightning fighters. Each aircraft had been meticulously maintained, with special attention to engines, navigation equipment, and communication radios. The success of Operation Vengeance would depend as much on mechanical reliability as on pilot skill. Admiral Yamamoto settled into the seat behind the pilot of his G4M1 bomber as engines began their warm-up sequence. The aircraft, bearing tail number V-17, had been specially configured for VIP transport with additional radio equipment and improved interior accommodations. Despite these modifications, the Betty retained its fundamental vulnerability: unprotected. Fuel tanks that could explode from a single incendiary. Around the bomber formation consisted of 2 G4M aircraft carrying Yamamoto and his staff, escorted by 6 Zero fighters under squadron leader Yanagiya's command. Standard procedure called for the escort to fly 1,500 feet below the bombers, providing protection against intercepting fighters while maintaining visual contact with their charges. Flight plan details had been transmitted via radio the previous evening, specifying exact routes, altitudes, and timing. The bombers would cruise at 180 miles per hour at 6,500 feet, following a direct course to Balal Airfield. Total flight time was calculated at 1 hour and 50 minutes, including a brief fuel stop before continuing to Bougainville. Japanese intelligence had reported increased American air activity in the Solomon Islands, but this was attributed to routine patrol operations. No specific threat to VIP flights had been identified, and Yamamoto's security detail saw no reason to alter standard procedures. The Admiral's schedule had already been distributed to multiple commands for coordination purposes. The Betty's crew consisted of 7 men, including pilot Lieutenant Takeshi Kotani and navigator Lieutenant Hiroshi Hayashi. Both officers had extensive experience flying senior commanders throughout the Pacific Theater. Their aircraft carried standard defensive armament, 120mm cannon in the tail position, and 4 7.7mm machine guns in beam and dorsal positions. As the engines reached operating temperature, Yamamoto reviewed intelligence summaries from his aide. American forces continued to reinforce their positions in the Solomon Islands, but Japanese commanders believed their air superiority around Rabaul remained intact. Recent combat reports showed favorable exchange ratios for Zero fighters against American interceptors. At 0800 hours, the tower cleared the formation for takeoff. Yamamoto's bomber rolled down the coral runway, followed by the second G4M carrying his staff officers. The 6-0 escorts took off in pairs, joining the formation as it climbed toward cruising altitude. None of the participants suspected they were flying into the most carefully planned ambush of the Pacific War. The Japanese radar station on Bougainville swept the skies with its primitive Type 21 equipment, capable of detecting aircraft at ranges up to 100 miles under ideal conditions. However, the technology possessed critical limitations that Allied intelligence had identified and exploited. Low-flying aircraft remained invisible to Japanese radar operators, creating a corridor of vulnerability that the P-38 mission would exploit. 18 Lightning fighters maintained radio silence as they skimmed just 50 feet above the Pacific Ocean, their twin engines creating minimal radar signatures. Major Mitchell led the formation with precise navigation, following a carefully calculated course that would bring them to the intercept point exactly as Yamamoto's formation approached. The margin for error was measured in minutes. Japanese radar operators at Rabaul tracked the Admiral's formation as it departed on schedule, noting its steady progress toward Bayale. The two G4M bombers and 6-0 escorts appeared as expected contacts on their screens, following the filed flight plan without deviation. No unusual activity was detected in the surrounding airspace. Meanwhile, the American formation flew beneath radar coverage, their presence unknown to Japanese defensive systems. The P-38s had been equipped with additional radio equipment for the mission, but maintained strict communication silence to avoid detection by Japanese monitoring stations. Hand signals and formation flying replaced radio coordination. At 09:35 hours, Yamamoto's formation was detected by Australian coast watchers hidden in the jungle hills of Bougainville. These observers, equipped with powerful binoculars and radio transmitters, had been tracking Japanese air movements for months. Their reports provided real-time confirmation of the target formation's position and heading. The Coast Watcher network represented one of the Pacific War's most effective intelligence operations. Scattered across Japanese-occupied islands, these observers risked their lives to provide Allied forces with detailed information about enemy movements. Their reports had enabled numerous successful intercepts and bombing missions. Japanese communication procedures required regular position reports from VIP flights, transmitted via the compromised JN-25 code. Each transmission provided American cryptographers with updated confirmation of Yamamoto's location and timing. The Admiral's adherence to standard procedures had made him an ideal target for interception. As the morning progressed, both formations converged on their fateful meeting point above the Solomon Islands, neither side aware of the other's presence until the final, decisive moments. At 09:34 hours, Captain Thomas Lanphier spotted two dark specks against the morning sky, exactly where intelligence had predicted Yamamoto's formation would appear. The P-38 Lightning fighters had climbed to 18,000 feet for the final approach, their twin engines straining in the thin air. Below them, 16 more Lightnings maintained radio silence as they prepared to engage the Zero escort. Bogies 10 o'clock high. Lanphier transmitted breaking radio silence for the first time in nearly 2 hours. The two G4M bombers were clearly visible, flying in loose formation with their 6-0 escorts positioned defensively around them. The Japanese had no warning of the approaching American fighters. The mathematics of aerial combat heavily favored the Americans. Each P-38 carried 1,425 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition and 150 rounds of 20 mm cannon shells. The concentrated firepower from a single Lightning exceeded that of 3-0 fighters. More critically, the American pilots could engage from beyond the effective range of Japanese defensive guns. Squadron leader Yanagiya spotted the P-38s at the same moment his radio crackled with warnings from his wingman. The Zero fighters immediately jettisoned their external fuel tanks and turned toward the threat, but they faced an impossible tactical situation. The Americans had achieved complete surprise at optimal altitude and speed. Lieutenant Rex Barber lined up behind the lead G4M bomber, his gun sight centered on the aircraft's unprotected fuel tanks. The Betty's twin engines provided a large target, while its lack of armor made it vulnerable to even single hits from 50 caliber rounds. At 400 yards range, Barber pressed the trigger. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. 4 50 caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon concentrated their fire on the bomber's right engine and wing root. The unprotected fuel tank exploded in a brilliant orange fireball, sending the aircraft into an uncontrollable dive toward the jungle below. Yamamoto's pilot, Lieutenant Kotani, attempted evasive maneuvers as his aircraft began losing altitude. However, the G4M's control surfaces had been damaged by the initial burst, and hydraulic fluid streamed from severed lines. The bomber's fate was sealed within seconds of the first shots. At around 43 hours, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's aircraft crashed into the jungle of Bougainville, killing all aboard instantly. The architect of Pearl Harbor was dead, victim of American intelligence, technology, and precision. The second G4M bomber, carrying Yamamoto's staff officers, met a similar fate as Lieutenant Barber turned his attention to the surviving aircraft. Chief of Staff Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki's bomber took multiple hits from concentrated P-38 firepower, crash landing in the ocean near Moila Point. 3 staff officers, including Ugaki, survived the crash but suffered serious injuries. Meanwhile, the aerial battle between P-38s and Zero fighters raged at lower altitude. The American pilots exploited their speed and firepower advantages, engaging the Japanese escorts in high-speed diving attacks. The Zero's traditional advantages in maneuverability meant little against opponents who refused to engage in turning combat. Lieutenant Kenji Yanagiya's Zero took cannon shells through its engine compartment, forcing him to attempt an emergency landing on the beach below. His aircraft cartwheeled across the sand, throwing him clear but leaving him with multiple injuries. 3 other Zero pilots were killed in the engagement, while 2 managed to escape back toward Rabaul. The entire action lasted less than 10 minutes. American losses totaled 1 P-38 Lightning, shot down by defensive fire from the Japanese escorts. First Lieutenant Raymond Hine crashed into the ocean but was later rescued by Allied forces. Against these minimal losses, the Americans had achieved their primary objective while inflicting devastating casualties on the enemy formation. Japanese search and rescue operations began within hours as Rabaul headquarters lost radio contact with both bomber aircraft. Coast watchers reported large fires in the jungle, suggesting at least 1 aircraft had crashed. However, the fate of Admiral Yamamoto remained unknown for nearly 18 hours. The discovery of Yamamoto's body came at dawn on April 19th, when Japanese search teams reached the crash site. The admiral had been thrown from his aircraft during the impact, still strapped in his seat. His white dress uniform was intact, and his ceremonial sword remained at his side. The sight devastated the search team members, who immediately radioed confirmation to Rabaul. News of Yamamoto's death sent shockwaves through the Japanese command structure. The loss of their most experienced and respected naval strategist could not be easily replaced. Within hours, emergency conferences were convening in Tokyo as military leaders struggled to comprehend the implications of their catastrophic loss. The Americans had achieved more than a tactical victory. They had struck at the heart of Japanese naval planning and morale. The encrypted message arrived at Imperial Navy headquarters in Tokyo at 15:47 hours on April 19, 1943. Admiral Osami Nagano, Chief of Naval General Staff, read the communication 3 times before accepting its terrible contents. Admiral Yamamoto, killed in action, represented more than the loss of a single officer. It marked the beginning of Japan's strategic collapse in the Pacific. Within the hour, emergency conferences convened at the highest levels of government. Emperor Hirohito received the news in stunned silence, understanding immediately that Japan had lost its most irreplaceable military leader. Yamamoto's strategic vision had guided every major naval operation since Pearl Harbor, and no other officer possessed his combination of experience, intellect, and international reputation. The psychological impact extended far beyond military circles. Yamamoto represented Japanese naval tradition and excellence to millions of citizens who viewed him as invincible. His death demonstrated that even Japan's most protected leaders were vulnerable to American technology and intelligence. If the Americans could kill Yamamoto, no one was safe. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo faced an immediate crisis of confidence. Military production was already falling behind American output by catastrophic margins. In April 1943, Japanese aircraft factories produced 1,287 aircraft of all types, while American plants delivered 7,267 aircraft during the same period. The loss of Yamamoto compounded these material disadvantages with a devastating blow to leadership and morale. Intelligence. Reports suggested the Americans had somehow obtained detailed information about Yamamoto's flight plan. This possibility terrified Japanese cryptographers who had maintained absolute confidence in their JN-25 naval code. If their communications were compromised, every operation and movement could be predicted and countered by enemy forces. The Navy immediately implemented enhanced security procedures for all senior officers. VIP flights would require larger escorts, alternative routing, and radio silence. However, these measures came too late to save Japan's most valuable commander and could not address the fundamental intelligence vulnerabilities that had enabled the attack. Yamamoto's replacement, Admiral Manichi Koga, lacked his predecessor's strategic brilliance and international prestige. The new commander inherited a deteriorating situation with dwindling resources and mounting American pressure. Japanese naval operations would never again demonstrate the coordination and tactical excellence that had characterized Yamamoto's leadership. The ripple effects of April 18, 1943, would influence every subsequent battle in the Pacific War. The success of Operation Vengeance validated the massive Allied investment in intelligence operations throughout the Pacific theater. Station Hypo's cryptographers had processed over 140,000 intercepted Japanese radio transmissions during the first quarter of 1943, extracting strategic intelligence that shaped American planning at every level. Commander Joseph Rochefort's team expanded their analysis beyond naval communications to include diplomatic and Army codes. The purple cipher machine used for highest-level diplomatic communications had been reconstructed by American cryptographers without ever seeing an actual device. This breakthrough provided access to Japanese strategic planning and political decision-making. Intelligence estimates revealed the true scale of Japan's industrial crisis. Raw material shortages were forcing production cutbacks across all military categories. Steel allocation for naval construction had decreased by 40% since 1942, while aluminum for aircraft production was virtually unavailable. These shortages would only intensify as American submarine warfare disrupted supply lines. The psychological assessment of Yamamoto's death proved equally valuable. Intercepted communications showed declining morale among Japanese naval personnel and increasing pessimism in strategic planning documents. References to decisive battles and final victories appeared with greater frequency, suggesting desperation rather than confidence. American production statistics provided stark contrast to Japanese struggles. In April 1943, American shipyards launched 140 vessels totaling over 1 million tons, including 3 aircraft carriers and 12 destroyers. This monthly output exceeded Japan's entire annual production capacity. The mathematical inevitability of Japanese defeat was becoming apparent to planners on both sides. The intelligence advantage extended to tactical operations. American forces now possessed detailed information about Japanese defensive positions, troop movements, and supply schedules. This intelligence enabled precisely coordinated attacks that maximized damage while minimizing American casualties. Admiral Nimitz authorized expanded cryptographic operations, assigning additional personnel and equipment to intelligence gathering. The success of the Yamamoto intercept demonstrated that intelligence could be as decisive as industrial production in determining battle outcomes. Future operations would rely increasingly on this technological and intellectual superiority. Japanese attempts to enhance communication security proved ineffective. New code systems were implemented slowly and often contained the same fundamental vulnerabilities that had compromised their predecessors. The Americans maintained their intelligence advantage throughout the remainder of the Pacific War, reading enemy intentions while concealing their own capabilities. The death of Admiral Yamamoto coincided with the full mobilization of American industrial capacity, creating an unstoppable momentum that would dominate the remainder of the Pacific War. By May 1943, the Willow Run plant in Michigan was producing one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes, operating around the clock with 3 full shifts of workers. This production rate exemplified American industrial supremacy across all categories of military equipment. The Ford Motor Company had converted its automobile production lines to manufacture B-24s, applying mass production techniques that Japanese industry could never replicate. The result was overwhelming numerical superiority in every category of military. Hardware. American aircraft production reached extraordinary levels during the summer of 1943. Monthly output exceeded 9,000 aircraft of all types, including fighters, bombers, and transport planes. This figure represented more aircraft than Japan would produce during the entire remainder of the war. The mathematical certainty of Japanese defeat was becoming undeniable. Shipbuilding statistics told a similar story. American yards launched 1,149 vessels during 1943, totaling over 19 million tons of shipping. Japan managed 769 vessels totaling 3.3 million tons during the same period. The disparity in naval construction guaranteed American dominance in every future engagement. The loss of Yamamoto removed the one Japanese leader capable of innovative, strategic thinking in the face of overwhelming material disadvantage. His successors relied on traditional tactics and desperate expedients that played directly into American strengths. The doctrine of decisive battle, once Japan's strategic foundation, became a prescription for catastrophic losses. Intelligence intercepts revealed growing pessimism among Japanese commanders. References to honorable death and final sacrifice replaced earlier discussions of victory and conquest. The psychological impact of Yamamoto's death combined with material shortages to create a crisis of confidence that permeated the entire Japanese war effort. American forces pressed their advantages with increasing aggression. The successful intercept of Japan's premier naval commander demonstrated that no target was beyond reach of Allied intelligence and firepower. Future operations would exploit this psychological advantage while leveraging overwhelming material superiority. The tide of war had turned decisively. Japan's early advantages in training, equipment, and tactical doctrine were swept away by American industrial capacity and technological innovation. The death of Yamamoto marked the beginning of an accelerating collapse that would culminate in total defeat. The cascading effects of Yamamoto's death extended far beyond the loss of a single commander. Japanese naval aviation faced a crisis of leadership and experience that would prove irreversible. By autumn 1943, the Imperial Navy had lost over 3,000 experienced pilots, including squadron commanders and tactical innovators who could not be replaced. American pilot training programs demonstrated the overwhelming advantages of industrial democracy. The United States was producing 10,000 new pilots annually through comprehensive training programs that provided 200-plus flight hours before assignment to combat units. Japanese programs, constrained by fuel shortages and equipment limitations, managed fewer than 2,000 pilots yearly with minimal training. The qualitative gap widened dramatically throughout 1943. American pilots arrived at combat units with extensive gunnery training, instrument flying experience, and familiarization with multiple aircraft types. Japanese replacements often reached frontline squadrons with fewer than 50 flight hours and no combat training. The results were predictably catastrophic. Aircraft losses mounted to unsustainable levels. During the 6 months following Yamamoto's death, Japanese naval aviation lost over 2,800 aircraft in combat. American losses totaled fewer than 900 aircraft during the same period, most of which were replaced within weeks. The mathematical progression guaranteed the extinction of Japanese air power. Industrial production figures revealed the impossible situation facing Japanese planners. American factories delivered 27,000 aircraft during the second half of 1943, while Japan managed fewer than 7,000 aircraft of all types. This disparity included not only fighters and bombers, but also transport and training aircraft, essential for maintaining operational capability. Fuel shortages compounded every other problem. Japan's petroleum reserves were declining rapidly, forcing severe restrictions on training flights and non-essential operations. American forces enjoyed unlimited fuel supplies, enabling extensive training programs and round-the-clock combat operations. The strategic implications were clear to objective observers on both sides. Japan could no longer replace its losses in either personnel or equipment, while American capabilities continued expanding exponentially. The window for negotiated settlement was closing rapidly as military realities made Japanese defeat inevitable. Emperor Hirohito received increasingly pessimistic assessments from his military advisors. The death of Yamamoto had accelerated a process that might have taken years to reach its logical conclusion. Without their premier naval strategist, Japan faced the mathematics of industrial warfare with no possibility of victory. The wreckage of Admiral Yamamoto's bomber lay scattered across a hillside in the Bougainville jungle for decades after the war, a metallic monument to the moment when intelligence and technology converged to alter history's course. The twisted aluminum and steel fragments, eventually recovered and preserved, serve as tangible evidence of how modern warfare had evolved beyond traditional concepts of honor and invulnerability. Operation Vengeance represented more than a successful military mission. It demonstrated the transformation of warfare from industrial-age tactics to information-age strategy. The ability to decode enemy communications, predict movements with precision, and strike targets hundreds of miles away marked a fundamental shift in military capability. The days when distance and secrecy could protect strategic leaders had ended forever. The intelligence revolution that enabled Yamamoto's death continued throughout the war and beyond. American cryptographic capabilities, refined through necessity and innovation, became the foundation for Cold War intelligence operations. The techniques developed to break Japanese codes evolved into systems that would monitor global communications for decades. The human cost of technological warfare became apparent in the aftermath of April 18, 1943. Japan lost not only its finest naval strategist, but also the psychological foundation of its resistance. The certainty that American intelligence could reach anywhere, combined with overwhelming industrial production, made continued resistance increasingly futile. Historical analysis reveals the broader implications of Operation Vengeance. The mission succeeded because it combined superior intelligence gathering, advanced technology, precise planning, and industrial capacity. No single element would have sufficed. The integration of all these advantages created an insurmountable superiority that Japan could never match. The P-38 Lightning fighters that carried out the mission represented American industrial and technological achievement at its finest. These aircraft, produced by the thousands in factories across the United States, embodied the democratic capacity to mobilize entire societies for military purposes. Totalitarian regimes could not match this combination of innovation and production. Today, the preserved fragments of Yamamoto's aircraft rest in museums, surrounded by statistics and explanations that attempt to convey the magnitude of what occurred. On that April morning in 1943, the metal speaks silently of a moment when the future of the Pacific War was decided not by traditional military virtues, but by mathematics, intelligence, and the inexorable power of industrial democracy. What is your perspective on this part of history? Share your thoughts in the comment because every memory and reflection helps keep the past alive.